If you go to the website, you bottom on okay. And just learning, and that can make you the first.
I can project my screen.
Yeah.
So you bottom what I have?
Yeah, and just scroll down. And live. Citizens.
Sorry. I won't join the button. Is that okay? Or do you need me with the audio? Should I turn audio off here or what?
Yeah, I'll make you the host.
Recording in progress.
Yeah, but should I have audio on this so that the mic's catching everything, or is it going to catch everything? Okay, then I won't do audio. So I can share my screen. Good.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. ما بعد. الحمد لله that everything good to go. And inshallah, before we begin, النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم mentioned وفضل كلام الله على سائر الكلام كفضل الله على خلقه وكما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام that the superiority of the speech and the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over all of the form of speech is like the superiority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala himself over the entire creation. Inshallah, before we begin with today's presentation and lecture, we'll ask Khalid Rashid, inshallah, to come and render us the recitation.
I think that's it. I think that's it.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. لعنه الله وقال لأتخذن من عبادك نصيبا مفروضا. لعنه الله وقال لأتخذن من عبادك نصيبا مفروضا. ولأضلنهم ولآمرنهم فليبتكن آذان الأنعام ولآمرنهم فليغيرن خلق الله. ومن يتخذ الشيطان وليا من دون الله فقد خسر خسرانا مبينا. يعدهم ويمنيهم وما يعدهم الشيطان إلا غرورا. أولئك مأواهم جهنم ولا يجدون عنها محيصا. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات سندخلهم جنات تجري من تحتها الأنهار تجري من تحتها الأنهار خالدين فيها أبدا وعد الله حقا ومن أصدق من الله قيلا صدق الله العظيم.
Bless Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to take your student, Qadim al-Shaykh, and strength, grant him Qadiri and Qubuliyah, and increase him in his ilm and amal. Ameen ya Rabbil Alameen. Alhamdulillah, today's program is very, very important. How we can be firm in our faith, navigating the various complexities and the various issues that we have in our society, tracing back their history, their origin, and how Muslims in today's modern world can engage in a manner in which they remain true to the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We can also be productive in the society, inshallah. Our presenter is Ustādh Mobeen Vaid. We thank him for giving us some of his time, very valuable time. Alhamdulillah. Ustādh Mobeen, mashallah, has spoken on these topics, written on these topics extensively, and has lectured, alhamdulillah, in various venues throughout the US and so on and so forth. Very fortunate to have him, alhamdulillah. Listened to recently, I didn't even know he used to live in Maryland. And mashallah, I think it was 2-3 years ago, alhamdulillah, we met, and mashallah, that has blossomed into the second event now we're having here. Those brothers who were here last year, mashallah, we understood how important it was. And inshallah, today we can also do the same. Some guidelines, first and foremost. We say with the intention that we are trying to enhance our learning deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As we mentioned, that I am merely a distributor. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who gives. So the scholars and the teachers and the speakers that we have, they are merely conduits. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala inspires them to say words that could be impactful. But our intention has to be to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Many a times, we're sitting, and this happened in the khutbah and talks as well, that we're sitting in the khutbah, we're sitting in the talk, and the speaker says something which answers that same question, that very, very exact doubt or confusion we had, and they hit a spot on. And many a time, there's not even something which the speaker thought he was going to say before. But it is merely from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you see with that intention as well. Secondly, let's be attentive, inshallah. So as far as being on our phones or sleeping or this or that, inshallah, let's try for the next approximately 2 hours to be as alert and as attentive as possible. We do have benches and so on and so forth, papers and pens. Whatever knowledge is a prey, and writing down is the trap for that. So inshallah, we can refer back to these notes. This is also recorded. We can refer back to that as well, inshallah. And the intention is how we can learn and also become a means of engagement, and also how we can become a means of others better understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as well, inshallah. So without further ado, inshallah, I'll ask Ustādh Mobeen to begin the program. And inshallah, Ustādh, you can go until however long you please. It can be 2 hours, Dhuhr can be 2:15, 2:30, whatever you please, inshallah. There is lunch afterward as well, inshallah.
Okay. That's fine. Barakallahu feekum. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. قال رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي. Mufti Abdullah asked me to come in today and talk about issues that would help firm our faith. And as part of that, I said what might be good is to take a bit of a retrospective on some of the things that have happened over the past few hundred years in the West. I'm not going to go through a full history, and I don't actually have a ton of material, so inshallah I won't need to delay it. But what my hope is that perhaps we can keep it somewhat interactive and also through questions and answers. And inshallah, perhaps there will be some benefit for all of us today. Bismillah. So I actually like this image to start things off because I think it offers an interesting juxtaposition for reasons that sometimes are difficult to articulate. You look at this picture and it just seems off for different reasons, right? You see this picture of traditional Muslim women. You see what appears to be a masjid in the foreground, but then in the background, it's almost as if that's being overwhelmed by a society that's developing in a very, very different direction. You ask yourself, can these two things meaningfully coexist? And if so, for how long? And the world has changed a lot. And one of the things that's really remarkable if you read it, Islamic history itself, is just how beautiful Islamic civilization was, especially in the Middle Ages, but really throughout our history. Ibn Battuta, rahimahullah, in the 14th century, he described Damascus, and this is just a brief description of Damascus that I found from him, which I thought was really nice. And he said, Damascus is an exceedingly noble, glorious, and beautiful city, rich in all manner of merchandise, and everywhere delightful, abounding in food, spices, precious stones, silk, pearls, cloth of gold, perfumes from India, Tartary, Egypt, Syria, and places on our side of the Mediterranean, and in all precious things the heart of man can conceive. It is begirt with gardens and orchards, is watered both within and without by rivers, brooks and fountains, cunningly arranged to minister to men's luxury, and is incredibly populous, being inhabited by diverse trades of most skillful and noble workmen, craftsmen, and merchants, while within the walls it is adorned beyond belief by bats, by birds that sing all the year round, and by pleasures, refreshments, and amusements of all kinds. And one of the things that really sticks out when you look at it in Battuta's description and just look at Islamic history overall is the way in which the Muslims were really a dominant entity. They weren't simply able to impose their own religious beliefs. The religious beliefs didn't just spread, but they were manifested in the way that society was organized and orchestrated. Right? The beauty of Islam is reflected in the way that people lived among one another. And that changes a lot when you see Muslims in periods of decline. So L.P. Harvey, who's the person who's written a number of books on Muslim Spain, he talks about the decline in the 15th century. And one of the interesting parts of his book, at least for me, is he writes about the waning days of the Muslim community. And so by this point, you have Christians that have already taken over Spain. They've expelled almost all of the Muslims or forcefully converted them. There are laws that have been established that forcefully root out Islam. And there are a number of things that were done in this regard. You're talking about people forced to consume pork or sell pork. It's really amazing to read how difficult it was for Christian conquerors to just get rid of the vestiges of Islam, right? Decades and decades after Muslims have driven out, decades and decades after all these laws have been passed to try to remove every single Muslim symbol and sign, there's still frustration that women are wearing hijab still, like women are still, and they're not Muslim, but they're still veiling because it was there. And it becomes a frustration of the ruling elite. But in any event, this is all occurring. And one of the things L.P. Harvey, towards the end of his work, he talks about is a very sober anecdote. And it's registered as one of the last khutbahs that was given in what became Christian Spain. So now Muslims are gone, the masajid have been converted or are simply empty. Those people who had remained are almost all to a person forcefully converted. And this Muslim person there remains because he has a specific skill set that is useful to the political elite, so he's allowed to reside there. And he's a religious Muslim, and he gives khutbahs in his own home. And this khutbah itself, this Jum'ah, the Jama'ah of this khutbah is a total of 4 men and his daughter, who is now widowed because her husband left Islam. And so he has a widowed daughter, and then he has 4 men that are listening to this khutbah in his home. And he has this line of it where he's just lamenting the state, and he's talking about the day, the signs of the hour. It's very heart-wrenching khutbah. And then he says, what hurts most is that Muslims will be just like Christians. They will not reject their breasts, and they will not avoid their food. And subhanAllah, I think that's just such a very powerful line, where he says that they're just going to be the same. That's what hurts him the most. And he highlights dress and food. Like you're going to look at them, you're going to look at what they're eating, you're going to look at what they're dressing, how they're dressing, and there's not going to be any difference between them. And, that Khatib, rahimahullah, this sort of nightmare has become for many people in the West commonplace, right? It has become our lived reality for many, many Muslims. Today, however, the world has changed for us. And if we look across the Muslim world, we see corruption, see a lot of poverty, political subjugation, irreligiosity is spreading a lot across the Muslim world. By the way, this coin on the right side is a coin that was minted in England during the 8th century by a king named Offa. The reason I chose this image is that, you know, one of the interesting things that happens when you have power and when people respect you is that they want to be like you. They want to be like you. And so the Abbasids had a dinar, which on the outside of it, it was inscribed with La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah. So the kalima was inscribed on the outside. And I remember a few years ago, I went to a special exhibit in DC at one of the museums that was on the Vaid. And I was shocked to find the number of exhibits that actually had Abbasid dinars in them, like the sheer number of them. And I was actually thinking, like, well, all these people Muslim, because of how many Muslim things they own. And the person who was sort of curating that area of the exhibit, he said that these were their possessions that they would acquire in their lives that they really valued. And many of them were buried with these coins because they were considered the most valuable things they had. So they weren't necessarily Muslims, but they went, they interacted with Muslims, they got these things from Muslims and they cherished them because they saw them as very prized. Ibn Khaldun, he describes the impact that power can have on a society. And he says that the vanquished always want to imitate the victor in his distinctive characteristics, his dress, his occupation, and all his other conditions and customs. The reason for this is that the soul always sees perfection in the person who is superior to it and to whom it is subservient. It considers him perfect, either because it is impressed by the respect it has for him, or because it erroneously assumes that its own subservience to him is not due to the nature of defeat, but to the perfection of the victor. This sort of psychological insight to individuals is extremely, extremely powerful when we start to take a step back and think of the challenges that Muslims are facing today. At a time when Muslims were powerful, many people around the world wanted to be like Muslims. And I said this inscription was sort of mimicking. They refer to this in sort of modern art. When you study it, they refer to it as Arabic gibberish. Because it doesn't mean anything, but it's just designed to look like Arabic. Like the people who are inscribing and designing things were so enamored with Muslims that they saw that as a beautiful reflection for how they should design their own society, how they should mint their own coins that they're going to use for commerce and trade. And so they designed things, even though those things had no meaning. And you'll see this actually in many places. If you go back and look at medieval art, even Christian art and Gothic art that was designed and it depicts Sayyidatna Maryam alayhi salam. And obviously they don't know what she looks like, so it's just, this is all guesswork for them. But they'll have halos around her with Arabic gibberish. They'll put that there. Or you'll see that in churches because they don't have a calligraphic tradition the same way. And so you'll have Gothic, like churches that were established in that medieval period where they still actually have that Arabic gibberish that's been outlined. And some of the Christians during that time would commission Muslims to actually do calligraphy, even if that calligraphy just had nothing to do with their project, simply to adorn their things with. And there's a lot of studies that have been done on this, just how far and wide Islamic culture and civilization proliferated when we were in a position of honor and nobility. Today, obviously, the reverse is the case. And you see this everywhere where people want to mimic and imitate the West. A few months ago, I went for Umrah. And my trip was, we did Mecca first, and then it was my mom and I. And so we did Medina second. And then the last morning, we had a morning flight from Jeddah back. The flight was about 10 a.m. And so, or no, it was like 7 a.m. So it was at a bit of an awkward time. So the night before, we ended up staying in Jeddah. The night before, we ended up staying in Jeddah, close to the airport. And so we just went from Medina to Jeddah and we spent the night there. And I still remember going out just for a walk. And the hotel I checked into had a musalla in it. And yet, no one knew where the musalla was, except for this one guy who wasn't Muslim, who worked there. He's from the Philippines. It's just like the bag where he's like, I know where it is. And it was a large musalla. It's a large musalla. It was part of the hotel. And none of the people who worked there actually knew where it was in the building. And then I remember going outside and taking a walk. And I was the only one in the boat. Everybody was dressed like a Western. Every single person was dressed. It was just incredible to witness. And you see this across Muslim societies now. So for people who are from Pakistan, for instance, Urdu, written Urdu, is becoming very rare. People transliterate Urdu in English now. Almost exclusively. Very few people can engage with written Urdu anymore. And you'll see even ads make use of this. Signs on the streets, they're all using English. And if you listen now to how Urdu is spoken, they integrate into it English words all the time. All the time. Like that's what's happened to the language. And so what you have is a society that's actively being encroached upon by Westernization and is proving incapable to resist it in many powerful ways. And just as that's happening there, it's happening here as well. There are a huge number of Muslims that have a challenge living with the ongoing tension of being a religious Muslim in a society that seems to grate so against it. You feel like you're constantly in this state, like you're just fighting your society. You're always in this conflict between who you are and perhaps who you want to be to make your life easier. And it can be very difficult for that to sustain for a long period of time. Modernity itself is something that a lot of scholars have spent a lot of time writing on, especially Christian scholars. I'm not going to highlight what all of them say, but I'll just highlight a few anecdotes. So Charles Taylor is a big person in this field. He wrote a very, very lengthy volume entitled A Secular Age. And this book, among many, is considered to be extremely authoritative in chronicling the history of secularizing. By secularizing fear, I mean sort of the loss of faith. What happened? What happened to the world where in the 15th century, Christianity was just the dominant norm in Western Europe and throughout the West, and now where being Christian is really something that has no meaning, it's very much optional. And one of the things Charles Taylor writes is that although you can believe the same things you did, someone else did in the year 1500, one cannot believe those things in the same way. You just can't believe them in the same way. And it's because the world has changed. And he says that previously beliefs were intuitive. They rested upon bulwarks that made denial of faith, denial of God, if not impossible, really, really difficult. Really, really difficult. And he says that today we live in a world which is basically the opposite. That a person has to choose to believe. And that when one does so, he does so in the face of a culture where the bulwarks are in favor of unbelief, where what naturally people are inclined to is skepticism about belief. In the United States now, recent studies, the most recent Pew study showed that 30% of the US now is religiously unaffiliated. When you talk about the nuns, they say the rise of the nuns. So now 30% of the US identifies with no religion. And that's a big question for us as well, because oftentimes people say, oh, we're still living sort of in a Kitabi country or something like that. You say, okay, well, what does that even mean? Really, like, what does that mean? How many people count from the Ahlul Kitab who are still here? And that's a big question. And I'll say this, if you look at the Ahlul Kitab in the West, if you look at Judaism, for instance, you have three major denominations of Jews. You have the Reformed Jews that subsist or they exist here, and they're the largest number of Jews in America and across the West. Reform Jews have openly rejected the halakha. So they've openly rejected rabbinic law. They say the law doesn't apply to us anymore. They also say that the Torah is something that is not binding for all times and all places. So if you ever meet a rabbinic Jew, it can almost be like, okay, what do these people actually believe? I mean, really, there's no laws, no rules. Their values, everything. I mean, they're very affirming LGBT. It's across the board, right? They'll have like female rabbis. They do these services where people just like sing with the banjo and stuff. Like there's no religion there at all. I remember when the Muslim ban was happening during the Trump administration, one of the Eid khutbahs, a Reformed Jewish congregation came to Eid to show solidarity. And what shocked me wasn't that they came to say, oh, we're with you and stuff. But when the Salah happened in the beginning, they stood up and they prayed. And I said, these people have no deen. These people have no deen. The fact that you would just pray in another religion's prayer just like this, like just like you would just stand up and pray. And there's no deen there. That's such an extreme, like people don't realize how extreme that is to do. That is one of the craziest things for anybody who purports religion to do this. And yet they just did it. Their whole group did it. As if it was this great like experience for them or something. And so that's where Reform Jews are. Conservative Jews are not far off, even though they refer to themselves as conservative. And then you have a very small segment of the Jewish population that's Orthodox. And you have different groups of Orthodox, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox, etc. But the Orthodox are really the only ones that remain caring about things like halakha. They're very much, they tend to consolidate into very specific spaces where they live. They don't integrate a lot socially. They're a small minority of the overall Jewish population. So,
that's still the same breakdown in Palestine, like.
Yeah, so the brother asked about Palestine. That's a good question. Yeah, so like this is one of the political conflicts now in what they call Israel, right? Which is that like the people who are in power are generally irreligious Jews. They don't really care a whole lot about Judaism. Many of the largest Orthodox groups are actually anti-Zionist, and they believe that the establishment of the state of Israel is a violation of the Torah. Nevertheless, they comprise a powerful community within the country, and the government does a lot to placate them, And so, for instance, every single person in the country is supposed to serve a term in the military unless you're Orthodox. You don't have to. So they don't have to serve a military term. Most of those people don't work. They get funded by the government, right? And so that's because they spend their entire life in yeshiva, religious schooling instead. That's all they do their entire life. In the United States, in New York, there's a city or town called Kiryas Joel. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with it, but it's, I think, about an hour or so out of New York City. It is the most densely populated town in this country of Orthodox Jews. They have a massive yeshiva. And it also has the highest number of people per sort of like square foot, whatever, that are on government assistance and living on welfare. Because basically everybody in Kiryas is on welfare. And their entire life is just spent in the yeshiva. There's no real economic activity at all. And so that's still the case. I mean, that sort of line seems to be there. And Israel itself was established by Jews that were very, very irreligious. In fact, the introduction of Orthodox groups into Israel, if you go back and look at the history, many of them came from the Muslim world. Because in Muslim societies, you'll still find this. When you have a society and you have a world where people are still deeply rooted in religion, even non-Muslims tend to be more confessional when it comes to their faith. And so if you look at Coptic communities in Egypt, they'll be much more religious in their observance of Christianity than Christians in America, and how they dress and the seriousness with which they take their faith. It's likewise for Jews, right? And so you had all these very, very religious Jews that have been living in Yemen and other Muslim countries, and they came into Israel. They came into contact with these very secular and liberal Jews who've been living in the West. And, basically were pioneering the establishment of Israel as a state. And so, the sort of the way all of this is broken down, I think for us is also very instructive. I think it's really interesting for us because when you have a society where religion plays such a central role, like Muslim societies have historically, it has an impact on others. You can't help but be impacted by it. Just the same way where you have a very liberal, irreligious society, even otherwise religious communities will become illiberal. Will become liberal too. They'll become very liberal. And that's why, by the way, on the side note, the liberal Jews, because they hold all the power, there's like this very odd negotiation in that country that I don't understand. Like Tel Aviv, for instance, is considered the LGBT capital of the Middle East. Like the culture there is extremely, extremely liberal, European, atheistic. And like it's just a very, very large contradiction, which also makes Palestinians bad material for that society. And it drives a lot of animosity towards Palestine because Palestinians are still a very religious people, right? In fact, every single opportunity that the Palestinians had to vote on anything, they have voted for the Sharia, like every single time. Every single time, even though they're a small community living in subjugation and being persecuted over and over again, every chance they get. And this is why Westerners, they always say, oh, these Palestinians, they can't help themselves because they won't elect and support liberal leaders. But like, mashallah, we always see it, like Ramadan, all these things. Look how many people are at Aqsa, like the streets are flowing. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give them strength. Like, they're just not backing down. They're not backing down. And wallahi, that should be like a source of inspiration for us as well. That year after year they try to push. And like there are enough proud and confident Muslims there that say no. That just don't take it. Even no matter what state they're living in, they just don't take it. So I don't know. But anyway, that's Judaism. And Christianity is total mess. Right? Christianity is total mess. Just about every major denomination has a liberal branch. Most churches here have rainbow flags out front. The Bible itself, like there's no continuing notion of halal and haram. Like Sharia, the way we understand it for them is like totally a black box. They don't understand that at all. And so we're living among people where we have more and more distance. And that represents a real challenge for us as Muslims. The question is, how does this happen? There were many changes that happened over the course of the past 400 to 500 years, at least. There are political changes that happened. Of those political changes that happened, some people speculate the decline in monarchies is playing a role. Importantly, you had a new political arrangement, especially one defined in secularism. Right? So secularism plays a huge, huge role in defining how human beings are supposed to coexist with different beliefs and the role of the state in advancing that. So even today, one of the challenges that we have on an ongoing basis in a secular society is that laws continue to get passed that work against us. And when we object, they say, well, you can't see your own beliefs. Like the government is not beholden to your beliefs. And we look at that and say, well, you guys have beliefs too. And you're advancing those beliefs as laws. You're just calling them something different. Like that's your deen. And you're basically smuggling in your deen and forcing it on everyone else. But you're using language that pretends that it actually isn't a religion. And that's dishonest. And there's a good book, if you guys are interested on that topic in particular, that discusses it extensively. It's by Stephen Smith. It's called The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse. The Disenchantment of Secular Discourse. I think you'll enjoy that if you're interested on that topic in particular. But there's been intellectual changes as well. There's been many intellectual changes that have happened in the period of the, starting in the Renaissance, then the Enlightenment, the Reformation. We have all these really critical activities that happen in the West that are responding to the church. They're responding to the church. Right? And so you have the Reformation, which is a response to ecclesiastical authority, to the Pope and the Vatican. And you have this Protestant Reformation that comes about and says, no, we can all access the Bible on our own as individuals. And we can arrive at our own conclusions of what it says. Now, the early Protestants weren't that radical, but what's happened is that sort of seed really birthed this idea that each one of us can just access this text and produce novel outcomes. And that's like, even for us, we'd say, okay, Muslims, of course, like every Muslim can read the Quran, everybody can understand the Quran. But the idea that you just sort of independently can read it on and produce whatever conclusions you want, like no one's ever thought that way. And yet that's one of the byproducts of the Reformation, right? Is this sort of privileging and prizing of the individual and the capacity of the individual to do whatever he or she wants, unencumbered, even in religious contexts. The Enlightenment pushes that project forward and says what really unites us as human beings and how society should be organized is this underlying commitment to reason, rationality, that we can use our mind. And using our mind, we can come to moral truths. We can understand what's good and bad just through our mind. And that's a very radical idea too. It's a very radical idea. Many people don't realize how radical that is because of how commonplace it is for people to hear. For me, I think this is wrong, or I'm not sure about that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran says, وَمَا كَانَ لِمُؤْمِنٍ وَلَا مُؤْمِنَةٍ إِذَا قَضَى اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ أَمْرًا أَن يَكُونَ لَهُمُ الْخِيَرَةُ مِنْ أَمْرِهِمْ. It is not for a believing man or a believing woman when Allah and His Messenger have decreed something that they have any khiyara in that issue, that they have a choice. They have a choice. The idea that I can just sit back and construct moral truths on my own requires an unbelievable amount of arrogance. Like the amount of arrogance a person has to think that is stunning. And yet most people don't realize how much to sort of internalize the arrogance that they've developed from a society that privileges this idea that we don't need God, and that has been built on the foundation of me just using my mind to arrive at moral truths. And I'll deal with this sometimes where I'll speak to college students and some of them will say, I'm not sure that I agree with this. And they'll mention something in the Quran and Sunnah, and I'll think like, who told you? Like, who do you think you are? Wallahi, like really, like who do you think you are? Like this idea that you're so smart and that you're so brilliant, that it's not coming from a place of I don't understand or I'd like to understand better, but like I don't agree with. I don't think I do. Who cares what you agree with and don't? Like you're not the judge of anything. Who's to say your mind is that like omnicompetent that you can cut across so many different issues and arrive at truth? We additionally add in here cultural changes. And these cultural changes are significant for us, especially in America. When you talk about the dissolution of the family unit, especially over the past 100 years or so, starting with the early 1900s, the changes of economic activity that contributed to that, what's happened to marriage, what's happened to divorce, what's happened to promiscuity overall, and the spread of those things. Right? Like all of those things make it more and more difficult to live as a really like confident Muslim, right? Again, we can't possibly cover all of this today, but I'm going to try to focus on a few. And the main thing I'm going to touch on, at least for the rest of the presentation here, is this notion of liberalism. What is liberalism? What is liberalism? How can we understand it, and how does it intersect our conception of ourselves, as well as how we engage in society today? I'm going to talk a little bit about secularism as well, but as I mentioned, if you're more interested in that topic, I think you're better suited just going to some of the books, especially Smith's book. I think it's very good on this. So liberalism itself as a concept is most often understood politically. When most people hear the term liberal, you're thinking about liberal against conservative, right? Like you're thinking about the Democratic Party, right? I'm a liberal, not a conservative. That's how people understand that concept. But the history of the term and the concept liberal predates this sort of liberal conservative divide. Liberalism itself is actually a foundational belief, and it emerges in the 18th century, early 18th century. Some people say that it has an older history, but its most basic commitment is this idea of the individual, and that what the individual is entitled to is to live with total autonomy and freedom. Total autonomy and freedom. And so the Greeks had a little bit of this idea. the Renaissance happens, right? But then it gets formalized again by John Locke in the sort of 17th and 18th century. And the core, as I said, the core of liberal thought is autonomy, right? Autonomy, freedom, and equality. And in fact, the word autonomy itself, I think, is very apt for the way liberal thought expresses itself. Because autonomy, like linguistically, if you break down those terms, it is literally like the self plus law. It's making the self the lawgiver. It is making the self the lawgiver. It's making the self the hakim, which tells you just like the root of that term is the project itself is almost a form of shirk, right, in terms of what's being advanced. John Stuart Mill, he argued and sort of explained liberalism and said the burden of proof is supposed to be with those who are against liberty, who contend for any restriction or prohibition. The a priori, meaning the basic assumption, is in favor of freedom, is in favor of freedom. Freedom is the motif of liberal thought. And this is not just in the political world, it rests on certain beliefs about human beings and the nature of man. The nature of human beings is that they are free, is that they are individuals, is that they are not bounded or bonded to anybody or to any greater thing. So I guess the question for the group, and we can do a bit of a dialogue on this, how might we judge and evaluate such an idea? Are there problems? Are there areas in which we might actually find alignment? What do we think of it? By the way, the idea of freedom, it's like here, it's inescapable, right? Movies, popular TV, it's all about people breaking shackles. It's always about people breaking out of things, moving away from obligations that they have, transcending circumstances. So let's see, questions you have to give them.
I was going to try to answer your question.
Go ahead, please. Yeah, that's it.
Liberalism is built on its constraint is supposed to be the harm principle. So you can do as much as you don't harm people.
Okay.
But my question about that is your judgment of when you stop or start harming someone is totally random. Like I could do something that I'm free to do, but the downstream effects of that, like maybe not immediately, but somewhere down the line, become more harmful than hopeful.
Okay, so brother's talking about the harm principle and the way that harm gets, and Smith writes about this as well. So let me push back a little. So in Islam, one of the we have the Fawaid al-Fiqh. One of them is ad-darar yuzal, right? The harm must be removed. Prophet said, "La darar, la dirar." Said there's no harm nor is there reciprocated. So we have a notion of harm. So why wouldn't that be just like that? Seems to totally overlap like this liberal idea of harm, right? So.
Perhaps we're not the ones identifying harm. I don't know.
Okay, no, John, think about it, John.
Like the thing that you said about the prior
Yeah.
I think like that goes like that was diametrically to our in the sense of just what you said and like I mean there is obviously freedom and equality, those are all goals, but the definition in the sense that that's not like the a priori assumption that's like that so except for Allah, and after that then we have like all the freedom and equality, these individualism, all these are bounded by the subservience to Allah first, like as the first assumption.
Okay, mashallah. So the brother talked about Qari mentioned the a priori assumption has to be challenged and contested. This idea that humans are fundamentally free people, or that the essential nature of human being is this idea of freedom. We don't subscribe to that, right? We don't subscribe to that. In fact, one of the things that we say is that human beings are fundamentally enslaved, right? And we don't look at enslavement as a bad thing so long as that enslavement is driven in the correct direction, right? وَمَا خَلَقْتُ الْجِنَّ وَالْإِنسَ إِلَّا لِيَعْبُدُونَ. That I have not created jinn or man except for my worship. Ibadah ubudiyah, that a person is engaging in this act of slavery, being a slave to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, being an abd of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is an honorific. It's a noble status. It's a noble status. In the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the Prophet as an abd, it's a very, very high mention. Alhamdulillah alladhi anzala ala abdihi al-kitab wa lam yaj'al lahu aywaja. سبحان الذي أسرى بعبده ليلا من المسجد الحرام إلى المسجد الأقصى. Right? And so abd in these verses come in very seminal moments. And some of the Mufassirin, they say that this is in fact the highest status. This is the most noble mention of the Prophet in the Quran when Allah refers to him as abd. And Allah refers to him as abd. Right? Prophet Ayyub alayhi salam. Ni'mal abd. Ni'mal abd. What a beautiful slave. What a beautiful slave. So for us, we say, look, that's there. But we also recognize that some people are slaves of their desires, right? And so what people refer to today as freedom is simply enslavement to their base desires. It's a type of hedonism being repackaged as freedom. Right? In fact, what Islam does is it removes those shackles. وَيَضَعُ عَنْهُمْ إِصْرَهُمْ وَالْأَغْلَالَ الَّتِي كَانَتْ عَلَيْهِمْ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that from the things the messenger brought, that he removed the ties that were across their neck, those things that were chaining them up. Because this is the type of, we'd say, like enslavement to one's desires is that most people are happy. And the Prophet ﷺ, he wrote a letter, I believe one of the letters that he wrote said, Aslim tuslam. Submit to Islam, you will be safe. He didn't say Aslim takun hurra, submit and you'll become free. Right? Like this privileging and this romanticizing of the free individual, hurriya, is very much a byproduct of the modern age. It's very much a byproduct of the modern age. The idea that I can just be sort of metaphysically free in this total sense. No, we'd say that nobody can be because your entire existence is contingent upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. People use the term secular humanism. I'll say that that's a contradiction in terms. There is no human being in a secular. The only reason you exist is because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? The mutakallimin, when they spoke about creation, they said, they have Sheikh Justin, that the mutakallimin, they said at every single moment, Allah Azza wa Jalla is recreating the creation. At every infinitesimal moment. Right? It's almost like you see like the way that they used to do like comics or something. It would be a strip and then they'd have the pages with each scene and then you just flow them together as if it's a clear scene. Yeah? Right? That is the greatest of examples, right? But saying that like that's what's happened. That's what's happened. Like that's how much you are dependent on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's how much you're dependent on Allah. Right? He is closer to you than Hadadil Wari, your jugular vein. This idea that you're just out there, disconnected from God. That is a fiction. And what people are doing in embracing this type of attitude, embracing this conceptual framework, they're divorcing themselves from a recognition. It doesn't change the reality. All it does is it makes them slaves to Satan. It makes them become more and more hedonistic, more negligent of the reality of their role in this world. And so when we talk about one of the fundamental points of contradiction between us and liberal thought, it is this priority of freedom that is given to freedom in a way that is way beyond anything human beings have ever thought of themselves previously, and that is in direct that entails almost denial of reality as it is. And that's important for us to remember because we're not talking about our beliefs. We're talking, this is how it is. As a human being, this is who you are. This is who you are, whether you're Muslim or not. I'm not telling you about my personal, I'm telling you this is what the world is. And what you're advancing is something that is a denial of reality. And when viewed that way, I think you almost begin to look at people who have these types of beliefs as people who are just living in abject denial of the world. I mean, as crazy, and this is why when we talk about the differences, some of the philosophical changes that have happened, it's, Charles Taylor talks about how some of these beliefs about God were so taken for granted because this is actually what exists. That, like, denying that, sure, could someone deny it? Fine. But it's like, could someone deny that this table is in front of me right now? I mean, they could deny it. I'd be like, okay, like that's your opinion. I might look at you quite strangely if you're denying that this table. Like I say, okay, like this person's, but that's not like for most people, it's like, okay, like whether you deny it or not, it's here. It's right here. You can deny it all you want. It's here. The table's right here. Like it's just that real. And so your denial has no bearing on the reality of what's there. And this is what's happening as part of liberalism, is that they've taken something that is eminently real, that actually exists, that literally describes reality as it is. And they've made it optional to the point where people look at it and say, okay, well, that's just your like private belief. Like that's what you think about it, but we can all think about it differently. They've made it something negotiable in the minds of people, as opposed to being something that's simply a staple of existence as it actually is. And so that's one of the huge, arguably the biggest challenges that liberal society and liberalism itself introduces. What else? What are some other problems? Are there any other problems?
I have a question.
Yes, Bismillah.
Actually, I have two questions.
Uh-huh.
First question is regarding the Quran.
Okay.
That if someone wants to read Quran and try to understand themselves or herself or himself, so there are a lot of interpretations are in the market. So how he can or she can understand, and if someone try to go for it and then go for a wrong interpretation, so what is the consequence and what should follow? The first thing is like Arabic context should be in the mind when the ayah is revealing. What was the circumstances? What was the time, era, all these things. So, and the second thing is there are a lot of concepts in the market here, especially that someone says that the Quran is still anybody can understand, anybody can read, and there is no need for any other person to let them understand that.
Yeah.
And second part of the same question, like the Quran, whatever it is you are reading, and it is revealing by Allah in their heart. They say this rule is coming inside. There are a lot of people here in the YouTubers and other things, that they are going to misinterpret the Quranic things. That's why I just want to understand how we can go and move forward and how to deal with that.
Yeah, so barakallah feek. So inshallah, I'd like to correct if there's anything wrong. So the brother asked about like tadabbur and tafakkur of the Quran, I guess. Like, so there are different levels at which individuals like engage with the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For an Ami Muslim, there's a certain type, like the average, like ordinary Muslim, there's a type of tadabbur and tafakkur that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala encourages us to do, which is just reflecting on the message, contemplating Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation, and as a result of that, growing in our awe and reverence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We say, Rabbana ma khalaqta hadha batila. Oh Allah, you haven't created this all in vain. That is obviously a very different thing than people who are now trying to engage in the Quran and reading from it religious rulings and interpretations, or producing novel outcomes and things like that. And so an individual person on his own really can't do that unless he's reached a certain level of scholarship. It's quite high. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said that someone reaches that level, sort of the mujtahid, right? Someone who's qualified to do ijtihad, that when they have a correct ijtihad, they get rewarded twice. But even when they're incorrect, they still receive a reward, but they still have an ajr that they get. The ignorant person, however, has no such, they have no such safety net, so to speak, right? The jahil who just goes out and like interprets a verse however he wants, right? And there's a very, very famous quote that's attributed to Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, where he said, what sky would shade me and what earth would carry me if I said about the book of Allah that which I don't know. And so when you talk about people just sort of like opinionating on the Quran based on their own reading, well, these people are abjectly unqualified. And like that's like a scary thing for them in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It really is. It really is quite concerning for them in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so, may Allah guide these people, right? And so for us, again, like for an individual who wants to learn the book of Allah, they should go and study with the teacher, right? They should find reliable tafsir that they can read. You know, this is the level of the average Muslim, right? The same way that you would say, okay, well, like there's some nazila, there's some new fiqh issue. Let me like open up Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim, and Quran, or better yet, let me just like Google these things and figure out an opinion that makes sense on this issue. Like we'd say, no, like that's not, like, what do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing? Like this is something for which a person is really, really like risking a lot of their akhirah. And the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is worse than the one who invents against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Allah. Allah. And who's to say that the person who's just like a jahil isn't going to do that? Right? I mean, that's in the Quran. So how's this person going to have this confidence? And so, you know, an ordinary person's engagement in the Quran is ta'abbudi, it's for obedience and worship and reflection. A person should think about the Quran, think about the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the idea that now, like in an ultimate sense, they're going to be engaged in this ongoing process of interpretation with no qualifications whatsoever, well, that's a non-starter. No Muslim has ever said that like the average Muslim can do that. No one's ever said that. Even like the biggest reformist has never said that, that I know of. Allah knows best. So, just wanted to get back to this.
As I was listening to your presentations,
Yeah.
something came to mind, in history. That when humanity is going through good times, prosperity, so they will be forgetting that there is going to be the big judgment tomorrow. Whatever they do in this life, they are going to be accountable for what they are doing. Then at the end of Surah Al-Nazi'at, so you know, we are holding on to the desires of the nafs, which will lead us to Jahannam. So that is probably the core of you know, in a nutshell, the human history.
No,
If
exactly.
we do not be able to you know, accept and go by the laws of the Sharia, the laws of Allah, humanity is leading to
No, Allah protect us. So the brother, mashallah, he makes a very, very good point about, look, this is what humanity is, right? What you're seeing in the name of freedom. Haven't you seen the person who just takes his desires as his Lord? This is what you're seeing. They're doing it just like animals. They're even worse than animals. And so you see this decline happening very, very quickly. And it becomes very important for us to understand this history, because what you're dealing with an intellectual and philosophical history now that is over 4 centuries old, and that is being built on over time, and that we're finding ourselves in the middle of and saying, okay, how can we understand this? And how do we juxtapose ourselves against it? And so I'll just answer a couple of these other questions here. So the nature of man. What is it, the nature of man? Well, we believe that human beings are endowed with a fitrah. The Prophet ﷺ said, "La min mawludin illa yuladu ala al-fitrah," that none has been born except that he was born upon the fitrah. فَأَبَوَاهُ يُهَوِّدَانِهِ أَوْ يُنَصِّرَانِهِ أَوْ يُمَجِّسَانِهِ كَمَا تَلْفِظُ البهيمة الجمعاء إذ تجدون فيها جدعاء حتى تكونوا أنتم تجدعونها، أو كما قال عليه الصلاة والسلام. This hadith of Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ, he said none was born except that he was born on the fitrah. And then the parents make that person a Jew, a Christian, or a Magian. The same way, and the Prophet ﷺ, he offered an example. He said it's like an animal that has been branded. And so when they would brand an animal in the past, they would apply some sort of deformity to it. They would slit its ears or do something like that. And that way I know my horse is different from yours, or my camel against yours, because it has the branding that I put on it. Prophet ﷺ, he said, was it born with this? No, you did that today. And he said, then that's the same thing that these people are doing by leaving the fitrah, by making their kids Jewish, Christian, Major. Importantly, Islam is human. So the nature of man is inclined towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's inclined towards God. We're born with this. And it takes an active program of indoctrination to push people against it, to convince people out of it. Moreover, we say that human beings still have choices, right? We're mukallaf, we have taklif. We're moral agents insofar as we have to choose, we make decisions, right? Prophet ﷺ, he said that their deeds, that he said that all of you are going to be held accountable for your deeds, and whoever does good, then thank Allah. Whoever does other than that, then don't only blame yourselves. Don't blame anyone other than yourself. And so we have taklif, we're moral agents, we're mukallaf in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have decisions to do good or to sin, And so we have some nominal notion of freedom. We're not saying that we're like just living with the unique choices in our life. But nevertheless, we recognized where those decisions in our moral agency sits in the larger sphere of things, especially as it relates to reality itself. This is a really interesting excerpt from Shaykh Abdul Hakim Murad, and I like it, so I included it. And he writes here, and it's in one of his articles, he says that I don't accept there is a crisis of Islam. Actually, I think Islam is the great religious success story of modernity. Ultimately, you judge a religion and the validity of its truth claims on the basis of whether it is still appealing to people or not. And people keep converting to Islam. He goes further. He says, in fact, it would be a worrying indictment of the legitimacy of the religion in Islam if the modern world approved of us. We complain of negative stereotypes and hostility, but in fact, that's always been the way of the believers against the uncomprehending outside world. That's a sign of our legitimacy. Those religions that are approved of and patted on the head by secular, consumerist, capitalistic modernity are by that very same token a source of worry from the point of view of legitimate traditional perspective. So we should be proud that the modern world doesn't like us. It's a sign of authenticity. Alhamdulillah. And he says, in an age which has avowedly given itself to dunya and materialism, you will expect the people of truth to be despised. You will expect the people of truth to be despised. And I think, again, very, very prescient and insightful observations from the Shaykh. By the way, getting back to your question on harm, part of the reason I asked the question about harm is that the challenge with terms, and this is something that abounds in our society, is the challenge of categories and concepts, right? Just in the same way where we may say, okay, we have a notion of freedom in Islam, but that notion applies to technique and deeds and this and that. We don't believe we're just like, we have no choice in our deeds, but rather we're going to be held accountable for them. Nevertheless, in sort of a larger metaphysical sense, we recognize that we are in fact not metaphysically free. Hurriya is not the essence of a human being, ubudiyya is. Likewise, we have to unpack terms like harm, right? Because some might say, oh, that's harmful, but then who's deciding what's harm and what's not harmful? Who gets to decide? Like, who fills that container of harm with meaning? Who's harm? For us, when we look at the term harm, we'd say, well, there are harms that are worldly, and there are spiritual harms as well. There are things that can harm someone's soul. They can harm them in the akhirah, in the afterlife. And so we have a much broader conception of harm. And so someone might look at some of the things we do and say, well, that's harmful. We say, no, like that's only because you're perceiving it through a very limited lens. And you've distorted this concept in so many different ways to apply the term harm to it. Just like the term justice or injustice. Justice in the Sharia, to put something in its proper place. Injustice or dhulm, put something, put something in its improper place. And so for us, the greatest injustice, the greatest oppression is what? It's shirk. Inna shirka la dhulmun adhim. And each shirk is the greatest of all, the greatest injustice. And so when we talk about terms and categories, if we were to talk about justice today, no one would perceive shirk as being an injustice. But they may refer to other things in justice that we look at and say, no, that's actual justice. That's what justice looks like. But because you've so distorted these categories and concepts, you can't apprehend them. And this is something, Allah tells us, like the power of words, right? Wahi, what is wahi? It's language. It's language, right? I mean, Allah says about the mushrikeen, "In hiya illa asma'un sammaytumuha." These are just words that you've made. Names, mere names, sammaytumuha, that you've contrived and given to things. That's all it is. Right? Allah tells us about the munafiqeen. When they're told, "La tufsidu fil ard," don't spread corruption on the earth, they say, "Innama nahnu muslihun," that we're just out here rectifying society. We're doing good. Again, a distortion of concepts and categories. This is important for us to realize. Because one of the things that's important to take a step back in every once in a while when these dialogues are taking place is to say, okay, let's understand if we have the same basic assumptions of how these terms are being used. Because someone will ask you a question that's loaded with assumptions. Just loaded with assumptions and say, okay, well, I'm not conceding any of those things. And I'm not conceding that we actually understand these terms the same way. By the way, a friend of mine was in London. This is just yesterday. This is the streets of London. The streets of London. One of the brothers was telling me Elephant City looks the same way. Allahumma ustādh. It just tells you how far, like, people can just lose their minds. Just lose their mind. Where entire streets, you just say, what's going on? How did this become like this? Just madness, total madness taking over our society.
I think, going back to your point, I think liberalism is like morality. People, their morals change. And I think you can go back and say, like, some of those terms are subjective in their eyes, but we use objectivity based off the brand, sort of, whereas theirs is based off of changing times, what they think is the moral correct answer.
Yeah, I mean, you can read, one of the things that we're seeing is just how flimsy moral categories are and how there seems to be almost no limiting conditions to what people can justify. Almost nothing. Because you can suddenly make the worst things look moral and attempts to stop the worst things look immoral. So there's an interesting author, his name's Thomas Zaz. He has a lot of criticisms of psychology, and many criticisms of psychology I actually agree with this. But nevertheless, he's an internal critic of psychology. And one of the things Thomas Zaz argues for is the morality of suicide. And he argues that trying to prevent it is immoral. He says what's immoral is trying to stop it. Because he says that this is the freedom of the individual. What could be more personal than the decision to choose when to take their life, to live or die? How does anybody get off thinking they have the right to stop somebody else from taking their own life? Right? Like, that's the argument, and he makes this argument at length. And you read it and you say, khalas, like, you read the book, really at the end of it you say, khalas, like, you take Deen out of the equation, and there's no reason why this guy's wrong. Really, like, what would be the argument against him? What would be the argument?
Now we have a
Yeah, assisted suicide. Yeah, in Canada, it's really taking off. And they have ads for it. They have ads for it. No, they have proper, like, assisted suicide. They call it, like, they just have to give it a new label, right? They're going to say, they'll probably won't call it suicide anymore. I'm sure they'll start calling it assisted end-of-life care or something like that. And suddenly, no, seriously, like, you just give it a new label or something like that, and then everybody's using the label. And then it's like, okay, like, this seems like such a nice place to go. And hey, people are going to take their lives anyways. Suicides were happening anyways. But now, instead of jumping off a building and, like, now it's a mess in the street, and we have to clean up the streets, and, like, maybe other people get hurt and this and that, we're doing it in a very private location. The family can all be there to see them off. We're going to have a good, like, last meal and make it very comfortable and tell us like that. And it's like, okay, you just took something that is like the biggest tragedies that all human societies have looked at as such a tragedy. And now you've elevated it into an activity that has moral worth and moral content, right? And this is the case for anything. This is a case for anything. You can invert the moral norms of any society by just changing the categories, changing the concepts, changing the language, promoting it, pushing it in movies and TV shows, getting a political movement behind it. And suddenly, like, okay, like soon enough, you'll have some Muslims who say, okay, like we should support suicide publicly, but like privately, we don't want to kill ourselves. Let's say, khalas, like there's okay, then like there's nothing you won't support. There's nothing you won't support publicly. Right? And so let's go forward and tell just one word from the side, and then we'll do question and answer again, we'll do some discussion. So what happens to religion in this period? This is very, very important as a development overall. So between the 17th and 19th century, you had Enlightenment-inspired thinkers who worked very fervently on debunking traditional Christian and Jewish teachings, especially as those that were found in the Bible. And so these are some of the big names, if you ever read across their works: Spinoza, Hobbes, Reimarus, Voltaire, Paine, S.E. Bauer, and Wellhausen. If you read their works, they are very focused on critiquing biblical lore and biblical teachings. And they see this as necessary for opening space for secular modernity. You cannot have a fully secular society that's embraced until you weaken the authority of the church. And they argue two things about Jewish and Christian teachings. And these were two of sort of the central pillars of what became known as historical critical scholarship or historical critical thought. First, that biblical teachings were non-authentic, such that they could not be traced to the founding religious figures, Musa and Isa alayhi salam, but were created later on. And on this, by the way, we'd agreed with them when it comes to Christianity and Judaism. And then they said, secondly, that those teachings were open to many different interpretations, such that no one interpretation should be privileged. In fact, they said and argued that historically certain interpretations only came to be privileged due to power. So church councils adopting a particular understanding of the Trinity or Immaculate Conception or books for biblical canon, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we don't, at least as it applies to Christianity and Judaism, we don't really have major differences with them when it comes to this. Now, this entire scholarly program became known as the historical critical scholarship. Scholars who employ the historical critical method carry their tradition, which is to say that they look at religion, they look at their primary texts, and they ask these two basic questions. What's happened for Muslims now is that this historical critical scholarship is increasingly being applied to Islam. And the question is, one, are religious teachings authentic such that they can be traced to the founding religious figures in the Prophet ﷺ, or were these teachings created later on? More and more people are arguing that really core beliefs in Islam were invented. Core beliefs that all of the madahib are in ijma over. They'd say, well, if we trace the historical lineage of these ideas, we'll find that they began at least 150 years or 200. In fact, I was listening to one of these people who's engaging in historical critical scholarship, and he argued that the kalima including Muhammad Rasulullah, including them, was a later addition. So that was a later addition. And he said the kalima was actually only that, and that's an invention later times. And so you see how extreme people's ideas can be. How extreme people's ideas can be when it comes to this stuff and the way that it gets employed. The second thing about many different interpretations so that none gets privileged, and the idea of power. This becomes a central point, especially how many modern Muslims will discuss and critique the Sharia. Say, well, you're just privileging a certain position based on the authority of these individuals, right? As opposed to recognizing that people can access scripture, access religion differently, and they can read it differently, and they can have different understandings. Because when you read this verse through a gender critical lens, or a race critical lens, or this and that, you arrive at completely different conclusions. And there's, again, this is really just a very obvious thread to unravel the religion. I mean, that's the goal. The goal is to weaken the authority of traditional Islam, to call traditional Islamic expressions into question, to treat them as if they are resting on weak foundations, the same way that Christianity and Judaism are resting on weak foundations, and to bludgeon them in a way where the only like the dominant forms of Islamic expression become reform-minded and reform-focused. So the dominant forms of Islam become as weak and non-religious as Reform Judaism, which is not Judaism at all, or Reformed Christianity, which, like, there's nothing there. There's nothing there. So, again, keep in mind the historical critical scholarships, critical method, and where Enlightenment scholars really played a heavy role in advancing these types of ideas vis-a-vis religion. Craig Gay, he has a book called Why It's Tempting to Not Believe. I believe that's the title of it. And this is an excerpt from his book, where he says, one of the most consequential ideas embedded in modern institutions and traditions and habits of thought is theological. Stated bluntly, it is the assumption that even if God exists, he is largely irrelevant to the real business of life. To put this somewhat more tactfully, contemporary society and culture so emphasize human potential and human agency and the immediate practical exigencies of the here and now that we are for the most part tempted to go about our daily business in this world without giving God much thought. Indeed, we are tempted to live as though God did not exist, or at least as if his existence did not practically matter. In short, one of the most insidious temptations fostered within contemporary secular society and culture is the temptation of practical atheism, what he terms practical atheism, which is to live as if God doesn't exist. Just to say that a person doesn't remember him, doesn't think about Allah, doesn't actively filter what's going on in his day-to-day lives through what pleases Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or with any consideration of him. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, don't be like those who forgot Allah, and forgetting of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah caused them to forget about themselves. Allah caused them to forget about themselves. This is what happens. A person just loses himself. He loses himself in this world. So this is like when we talk about the bulwarks of modern society, this scaffolding upon which modern institutions and organizations have been built. This is it. This is it right now. And this rears itself just about everywhere you turn. If you guys have been following what's going on in public schools in this country, these are the debates we're having. We're having debates with people today who have given in to practical atheism and are looking at Muslims as if they're crazy. As if they're crazy. Right? In fact, if you guys have been following Montgomery County, the woman that heads the school board there, she was quoted in the media. She said, I feel bad for these Muslim kids. They're just parroting what their parents tell them, and it's all so hateful. That's what she said, honestly. That's how she thinks about this. Right? Like really, like we're these people. We are so like old world. Our beliefs are not fit for modern society. It's becoming a real problem for us. Becoming a real problem for us. Now, what happens to religion as a result of all of these like excursions? When you talk about sort of the philosophical corpus, the political changes, the cultural changes, one of the things that comes out of the Enlightenment project is we have to weaken Christianity and Judaism in order to usher in a world of pluralistic tolerance. Everybody can believe whatever they want to believe, and no one is judged. That gives way to basically religious indifference. And this is the natural sort of dominoes, if you will, of a secular society. Secularism begins from a platform saying, hey, we just need to separate religion and state, but we want to offer people a place to practice their religion very strongly. And that gives way to a society where religion really stops mattering a whole lot. That's basically the way it goes. And on a side note, this is something we're seeing in the Muslim world now, become ever more aggressive. There are, in fact, some Muslim speakers that are quite popular in the Muslim world who have begun championing this idea of insaniya qabla diniya, that we're humans before we're religious. Like being human comes before being religious. Right? Our humanity comes before Islam. We're humans first. Right? And this is like a big and active program in Islam. It's not like a small thing. And much of this work is now being funded by governments in the Muslim world. So when we talk about the way in which this has a cascading effect, it's not just here now, right? Like we can't really sequester some of these things to us in society, but instead now they're things that we're seeing every day. The fact that God has created control of this world becomes probably unpalatable to people. We all are seen as agents of our own lives. This is now the empowering rhetoric that we see from self-help gurus. And it was a staple of Muslim reform movements in the 20th century. So now again, this idea that we can live our own life, we can go out, we can everybody can be whoever he wants to be, right? Nothing can stop you. The only person who tells you no is yourself. If you follow ad campaigns, right? Every single like brand that's selling you something is telling you, okay, this is just be you. Just be you, right? Nike, it's just do it, right? No one can tell you no except for you. Don't let anything stop you. Break through every single last barrier. That becomes really almost a theme that undergirds modern society and that is just etched into the mind of every last person in the West. Alongside this, the internal liberation from fear or guilt embraced. And this is a big one, because one of the biggest critiques that they'll make of religion today, and that becomes almost an attack and weaponized against religion, is that when people live with religion, they live with a sense of guilt when they sin. And they live with this ongoing sense of, am I doing right or am I doing wrong? But if I can shed that out of my mind, if I can shed that out of my heart, I can be so free. I can be so happy, in fact. Like, why can't I just embrace myself? Why can't I live for myself? You'll hear this sometimes where people will say, I've been living for other people for so long, I just finally wanted to live for myself. And in order to live for myself, I went to Europe and backpacked for a month or something dumb like that, But this is what these people do, right? Like they'll talk about stuff like this, and they'll say, and that has a real effect, right? This has a real effect. If you think about the challenges related to marriage. Many people, part of the reason they get divorced, they say, I'm tired of not being able to do what I want to do. Really, like at some point, I want to be able to do what I want to do. I deserve to be happy. And you'll say, okay, well, how are you conceiving of happiness? What is happiness to you? Just going out and partying all the time? Is that happiness? There's really no happiness you can find in a household with children, husband and wife. There's no happiness there at all. And this is like, again, this is how these categories and concepts are deployed now. And so this liberation from feeling guilty, this liberation from anything that would stand in the way from you doing what you want to do becomes something that is so powerful for the average person. It's extremely difficult for us to try to minister to people who've been taken in and captured by these types of thoughts. And then the psychological allegiance shifts from God to man. Man is the prime mover, the agent of all his deeds, the governor of his own domain. Man possesses sovereignty in modern religious norms. And this is why more and more of modern religion becomes therapeutic towards the individual. It becomes personalist. Right? What is religion telling us? It's telling you to embrace yourself. It's teaching you how to be you fully. The most popular sermons from the big name televangelists all sell this message. Every last one of them. And religions subconsciously or unselfconsciously shift in this direction as well. So they speak less and less about the supernatural, right? Whether it's the malaika or jinn or anything else. You speak less about the akhirah. You speak less about heaven and hell. All of these things become topics that you don't see as much. And instead, you end up speaking more and more about community, mental health, right? All of these things become much bigger places of priority when it comes to topics. In fact, it's interesting because one of the things the Prophet said in the signs of the end of times was that people would speak less and less about Dajjal. They would speak less and less about Dajjal. Right? And that's like one of the things that we're supposed to remind ourselves of. Now, they become fitna to Masih Dajjal. We seek refuge with Allah and protection from the fitna of Masih Dajjal, the Antichrist. And it's one of the things that people are supposed to remind them precisely for that reason. The Prophet said at the time, then people will just forget these things. They won't mention them anymore. And so I think this is the last slide I have, and we can sort of do a bit of discussion after this. Allah Azza wa Jalla tells us in the Quran, وَلَقَدْ ذَرَأْنَا لِجَهَنَّمَ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْجِنِّ وَالْإِنسِ لَهُمْ قُلُوبٌ لَا يَفْقَهُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ أَعْيُنٌ لَا يُبْصِرُونَ بِهَا وَلَهُمْ آذَانٌ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ بِهَا أُولَئِكَ كَالْأَنْعَامِ بَلْ هُمْ أَضَلُّ أُولَئِكَ هُمُ الْغَافِلُونَ. And we have certainly created for hell many of the jinn and mankind. They have hearts with which they do not understand. They have eyes with which they do not see. They have ears with which they do not hear. They are like livestock. Rather, they are more astray. It is they who are heedless. It is they who are heedless and negligent. And subhanAllah, this is something Allah tells us throughout the Quran. That there are people who have sight that can't see anything. It's almost like they've been completely blinded to the ayat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, one of the things that people will lament, the people of hell, they'll say, وَقَالُوا لَوْ كُنَّا نَسْمَعُ أَوْ نَعْقِلُ مَا كُنَّا فِي أَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ. That if we only heard, listened, or had aql, actually had sort of a mind to use them, مَا كُنَّا فِي أَصْحَابِ السَّعِيرِ, we wouldn't be from the companions of the fire. We wouldn't be from the people of the fire if it weren't for them. Allah says that people can put themselves in a position where they become blinded to all of the signs, where their fitrah becomes corrupted, where their hearts get hardened, And for us, when we talk about tabat and institutionalizing tabat, it is living in a way that grates against all of this. It's something that takes so much more work today, but it happens through the remembrance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It happens through the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It happens through the jama'ah. And coming together with other Muslims. Because we can't do it on our own. Wallahi, we can't do it on our own. We recognize that we're not just like isolated actors, but we're actually embedded in societies and in cultures. So we need to be in cultures and spaces where it's normal to live as a Muslim, to think as a Muslim, to behave as a Muslim with other Muslims. Because without that, we're just going to be on an island surrounded. And the wolf devours the sheep that strays from the flock. The wolf devours that sheep. And so there's power in numbers. And the way that we establish that is by prioritizing and making sure that our own ibadah is something that we're on top of as Muslims and believers, whether it's our daily adhkar or our ongoing salawat, praying salah on time, especially fajr, right? So sleeping at a real hour, staying away from things that are sources of fitna, and asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala time and time again to give us salah. Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik, thabbit qulubana ala dinik ala ta'at. The Prophet ﷺ used to ask Allah, O turner of hearts, keep our hearts firm on your path. And so with that, inshallah, we can open up maybe just some Q&A. Bismillah.
So I just want to play a devil's advocate for a
Sure,
second.
Bismillah.
And there's a lot of Muslims who have like this pessimistic mindset where we're weak, we're divided, we don't have our numbers.
Yeah.
And then you look at the like you described, you talked about the conditions of the Muslims after the downfall of Andalus, and you look at more modern day examples with like Muslims in France who are unlocked to wear hijab, to more extreme examples like the Uyghur Muslims. And once you look at like these different things, something like John Locke's idea of like more classical liberalism can be like appealing in a sense that we have the freedom to practice our religion where other people don't. And on top of that, we have, for example, ink in itself is a result of that because we have the freedom to open an institution, to preach, for you to talk. So how would you respond to that?
No, so the brother asked a good question. He said that, in some ways, like we are beneficiaries of Western freedoms, and without those Western freedoms, we wouldn't have Ustādh or even like ink. And if you look at other societies that seem to be quite a bit more draconian when it comes to religious practices because they don't have those freedoms, right? And so I think there are a couple of things to think through, and it's a complicated question. It's a complicated question for a few reasons. One is that Like you mentioned France as an example. France is no less committed to liberalism and John Locke than America is. Right? France is a secular society. In fact, the restrictions that have been passed against Muslims have been done in the name of secular liberalism. That's what they've been done in the name of. They've not been done in the name of despotic authoritarianism or tyranny. They're saying, no, like, this is what secular liberalism actually means. This is what it means for us. And because it means this, there are certain things that we presumptively cannot tolerate as a society, right? It's least in the public square. If women want to wear their hijab in their house, fine. But if they're going to start wearing it here and here and here, well, this is public life. This public life has to be secular. We can't advance religions in public society in this way, in this observable way, because it undercuts the presumptive equality and pluralism that we want to have. So that's what France is arguing. And if you look throughout Europe, these are all liberal secular societies that have passed a spate of laws against Muslims, right? Like in Switzerland, New Switzerland, they banned minarets. Minarets. And it's like, oh, when did Switzerland become this like Islamophobic country or something like that? No one knows anything about half these places. Look at Denmark. You look throughout. A lot of these countries have laws that they've passed that are directly targeting Muslims. So in some ways, one could say that secular liberalism is very much at home with laws that formally outlaw and forbid certain types of practices. So that's one thing, right? I think the other thing that's complicated about liberalism is that, and liberal society, is that there's two different types of what scholars refer to as power. Even though it's not our terminology, nevertheless, I think it's useful in trying to understand dynamics and human dynamics. There's what people call hard power, and then there's what people call soft power. So hard power is the exercising of institutions to coercively change people's behavior or to simply oppress them. Soft power is not coercive in that sense, but it is nevertheless extremely powerful. So much so that there becomes a sort of logical endpoint that's reached without having to force people down that road. And so there's a Christian writer named Sidney Griffith, who's a scholar of Arabic Christianity, Arabophone Christianity. And one of the things he writes about, he has a book called A Church in the Shadow of the Mosque. And he writes about how did like Syria become majority Muslim when it was like the heartland of Christianity. And one of the things he denies and he rejects is this idea that Islam was just forced on the population. He says, no, like people weren't, it wasn't like the Inquisition after Spain. It wasn't like, right, where like Christianity comes in and just starts like forcing people to leave their faith and all that. No, because that never happened. But what did happen, he says, is that you change the language. So you go from a society where your religious norms are in Syria, and now the whole society is speaking Arabic. And they're greeting each other with salam. And now you're on Muslim turf. You have adhans going on in the streets. You have people celebrating Eid. Women are dressing with hijab. Men are like this. All of this stuff is happening. Masajid are being built. And you're surrounded by Muslims. And he says at some point, the ability of the average person to resist that becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. Such that sure, you went from being the dominant, it was an exclusively Christian society, to now one where you're a small minority. We're a small minority. And he says that's the soft power of like the Muslim political empire, is that like even it's really interesting because the earliest known Christian writer that wrote in Arabic in defense of Christianity, he wrote an article on the Trinity. And it's actually, they don't know who the writer was, but it's called Fi Taklith Allah, Allahu Wahid. It's on the triune or the triune nature of God. And he is using the word Tawheed to try to define the Trinity. And he, in fact, refers liberally to even verses of the Quran in support of his argument. And you can see how difficult that is. Like you're just playing on someone else's turf. Like just try convincing the average Muslim that like the Thalatha is wahid, you know, like it's not going to, like you've lost, like the discursive context isn't one that's giving you the same chance, so to speak, right? There's a particular type of soft power that gets introduced when Muslims are in politics, are in political authority. What we might say is that all societies have a specific ways in which they're arranged, and they have certain forms of soft power that can exist. And so there's sort of the example of Palestine or the Uyghurs. May Allah make things easy for them, right? Where they are an oppressed minority of Muslims, and you have outside of that actively you're trying to get them to change their beliefs, explicitly so. But then you have soft power that says we don't need to do any of that. These people are going to change their beliefs on their own. We don't need to force them out of them. We'll give them enough TV shows. We'll give them enough smartphones. We'll give them like a way of dressing and living. And we'll surround them by all this decadence. And at some point, they're all going to give in. And at some point, they're all going to give in. And in some ways, soft power is a lot more difficult to exist. Partly because you don't see it. Partly because you don't see it. And you don't realize the way it is aggressing upon you. And so you end up losing a huge number of your own faithful in a way that's not even like, it's not something that you like really acknowledge except through anecdotes. And over time, through aggregated statistics, we say, okay, like the number of Muslims born, how many of them transmitted their faith generationally? How many are capable of actually transmitting Islam to their children? What are the percentages of something like that? What happens generally? How many are marrying outside of the religion? Right? How many Muslims are marrying outside of the religion? It's happening more and more now. Like just taking a step back and saying, okay, like how many are we losing? We might be losing more than the Uyghurs who are in detention in some way, right? Like you might, and then the people in Palestine who are in Gaza, surrounded by tanks, and they have walls set up with barbed wire that they can't get through. Like you actually might be losing more people than Muslims in Syria that are in a society that's been completely destabilized and is war-torn. And yet, those people, for whatever reason, may prove more capable in holding on to their faith than you, who might look and say, well, we have all the freedoms to practice our religion that these people don't. But we're doing so in a context where the soft power is far, far more aggressive. And it's directing people to a life in a particular way. In fact, one of the slides I have is that this becomes a major problem for us in liberal society, that Muslims feel the only way to convince themselves and others of what they believe is if they can describe their beliefs through the language of liberalism. And the Quran and Sunnah get measured against liberal thought, and everything gets refactored in liberal language. So Islam now gave women's rights. Hijab is our freedom. You know, anything that derogates from liberal norms is up for reform or abrogation. The Sharia itself is a liberal enterprise. I remember this was a few years ago. Islam, the theme of their conference was life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That was the theme of the conference itself. It was literally life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so we've seen this now that's happening. So it's like, okay, you know what? The government doesn't need to like force you to change it if you're changing it on your own. Right? Like, why would you think about France, right? In America, why would they need a niqab ban in a country where no one's wearing the niqab? Right? Like, why would they need to ban something that no one's doing? You only ban something if it's actually being seen in numbers. In some ways, you might say, okay, like France probably had to pass that because more Muslim women there were actually wearing niqab than here. And here, it's like you were like, oh, alhamdulillah, America. I know, but I always think to myself, well, how many Muslims, especially in America, actually wear niqab? Such that that would become something that like our society actually notices. That people outside of us notice and say, wow, like they're actually in fact, no, it's like extremely rare, even in masajid. And so what happens is when you shift in that way, and when your own sort of sensibilities end up being changed, in some ways that ends up being far more powerful. And the reason that this problem is exacerbated in some ways is that it's not localized to the US. Like in some ways, this country is the engine for cultural development around the world. Around the world. So suddenly you see like rainbow flags going up in Muslim countries, and it's not far away, right? I mean, really, like these types of things. You look at the movies that are coming out, right? You look at the media products, you look at the ads, you look at the way people dress, you look at the way people talk, and it's like, okay, like the soft power of the West is so extremely powerful. It is so extremely powerful. I can't remember which, there was a famous Marxist, I can't remember which one. But he said, if you could give me the power of American media, he said, I would make the entire world, it may have been a communist, I would make the entire world communist in a week. He said, I would make the entire world communist in a week. He said, that's all it would take me. He gave me that amount. Right? And that's like people recognize it. People recognize how powerful it is, because now it's like, what does it mean? Like when all of your culture, when all of your heritage, when all of that's been lost. Like that's the tragedy, right? In some ways, it's like, that's what we have to guard against. Because in secular societies, and especially in liberal societies like ours, what ends up being eliminated in religious communities is what they call the religious middle. Because religion becomes such a strong source of tension, either you embrace and fight to hold on to your religion, or you lose it. So in societies where religion is more at home, you can have plenty of people that are just kind of religious. Just kind of like unselfconsciously, they're not the most religious people in the world all the time, but they still care about deen. And there are plenty of Muslims like that today. They're just kind of like living Muslims, right? And they're not perfect. They have a lot of problems, right? They may do a lot of haram things, but nevertheless, they're not like kuffar. Okay? That profile of person in secular liberal societies has a very tough time continuing on. Because at some point, that person is going to get stretched one direction or another. And this is why when we talk about like the problem of liberalism, we're not saying something that's like, okay, what's worse? We're saying is that it mounts a different type of challenge for us. It mounts a different type of challenge for us because the challenge of authoritarianism and oppression is in your face. You know it. You know what you're up against. You recognize it immediately. The problem with liberalism is that it's a challenge that is invisible to the average Muslim. Not only is it invisible, most people have internalized the liberal and secular world and accept them as the natural way of seeing the world. So much so that anybody who calls them into question is looked at as being quite strange and different. And so because of that, it represents a different type of problem for us. A different type of problem for us than other problems that we face. And if you look in the past, like sort of the fixity problems that Muslims have, scholars spent a lot of time on them, right? Like if we just like compare history, for instance, you look at groups like the Khawarij, right? The Khawarij came in, they were extreme, right? Very extreme, like in their hudu, in their takfir, and all of these things. And the Khawarij fought, they killed Muslims, etc., right? Muslims fought against the Khawarij. The Khawarij didn't last. They didn't really last. Whereas the Mu'tazila come in and they offer a very convoluted theology that praises the mind. And that becomes a source of fitna for centuries. For centuries. And you have scholar after scholar, book after book that's focused on understanding and refuting Mu'tazili thought. That becomes a central focus. And today it's like, okay, there's sort of like the hard power issues, but there's like the soft power of new intellectual currents that are hitting the heart of how people conceive of reality itself. And these are central questions. These aren't like federal issues. The nature of man, what exists, the place of God, right? These aren't like the furu'a, the deen. These are the usul issues. Asli issues for us. So the idea that like we have to be engaged in conversation with these issues such that we recognize their problems and are competent and capable of identifying and addressing them is immense. It becomes an immense responsibility for us, especially as more and more Muslims get into this and struggle with this. They're going to need people who are capable of explaining why that's a problem. Why just like romanticizing this notion of freedom uncritically actually becomes like just is like a quick path to kufr, right? And why it goes against and contradicts so many of our beliefs. Like we have to be able to break categories, break concepts down, explain this to people. And alongside that, we have to recognize that there's sort of the aqdi work that's done, But then there's alongside that the work of sort of tazkiyah that has to be done for everybody, because we're not just sort of a mind, we have a soul. And that soul has to be nourished. And there are people that can be confused about a million things. And just a good Ramadan. And Allah helps them, right? Allah helps them for something like that. So, we remind people sort of coming back to the deen, like focusing on their adhkar, focusing on their salah, focusing on their siyam, focusing on all of these things. Alongside sort of the work of trying to convey to people where the problems are. Allah knows best. Hope that can come. Any other questions? I think there sometime. Just 8 minutes left. It sounds like a room done. This one.
So, I saw a clip the other day of a theoretical society where hijab was enforced theoretically.
Okay.
So hijab was enforced upon a population, but at the same time, the person was arguing that they weren't ready for it and they didn't accept it per se.
Okay.
They were protesting against that hijab enforcement.
Okay.
So, for example, if we want to move away from like a liberal society to a more Islamic one, how do we do that? Do we have to just enforce it on them, or should we try to first get the people to accept it without enforcing it?
Yeah, so I guess there's places where those protests have happened, like against hijab. I think Iran is probably the biggest example where they had that recently. Although I don't know how much we'd call that like an Islamic society these days, or even before. So it's real. Like, look, I think it's very tough to just like randomly have an issue that you try to force in when the rest of your society doesn't like support that at all. When you have such a liberal society, right? They say today like the rates of atheism in Iran are like competing with a lot of European countries now. Like it's a very, very atheistic society, which is, it's a huge problem. And so, when you talk about how do we change societies, Allah knows best. We try to follow the examples of the Anbiya, which is minimally what can we do? It's amr bil ma'ruf and nahy anil munkar. Call to good, we forbid the evil. We give da'wah. قُلْ هَذِهِ سَبِيلِي أَدْعُو إِلَى اللَّهِ عَلَى بَصِيرَةٍ, right? But I call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with knowledge, upon clear evidence. That's all we can do. That's all we do, right? That we call to the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ وَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. Whoever wishes, they believe. Whoever wishes, they don't. And so when we talk about changing society, it begins with us, the way we live, our households, the type of cultures that we normalize in our spaces, that we're giving da'wah, that we're calling good and forbidding evil, that we're reminding people. And if people don't remember or don't heed our guidance, so be it. That perhaps we'll be forgiven in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because at least we reminded them. That's like, that's it. That if nothing else, at least Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us that. At least we get that in front of them. So we're just forgiven for all this stuff that's happening. We're not held to account because at least we said something. At least we tried. And perhaps some people will adhere to it. You don't know. You don't know what's going to penetrate people's hearts. You really have no idea. And if we're rejected and we're ridiculed and all that, Bismillah. All of the Anbiya, right? Allah tells us to the people of Hud, إِنَّا لَنَرَاكَ فِي سَفَاهَةٍ وَإِنَّا لَنَظُنُّكَ مِنَ الْكَاذِبِينَ. They said that we see in you safaha, stupidity. That's what they said. And we think you're from the line. Right? That's what they said. And that's the Nabi of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that they told that to. So there's no guaranteed, like, this is the equation for people accepting Islam. No. Right? We might say that when Muslims are able to be in sort of control of things, then it's both bottom up and top down, where they can establish sort of culture that reinforces the norms, and then society on the top also have laws that reflect that. That both of those things tend to go hand in hand. You can't have this top-down random things that don't conform to a society that adheres to those at all. And you can't have, you can't have laws that are just completely in conflict. Like there has to be some sort of alignment between those two things. And so, we're invested. We're invested because of the way in which this is changing, like the people around us. We're invested because we live here right now. We're invested because these things are global. because these things are global now, and they're being exported by the day, they're being promoted by the day, and that's like the real challenge for Muslims everywhere. And inshallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will use us to do some khair, to benefit others, and forgive us along the way. And Allah knows best. You had something? Bismillah.
I have a question. It's short. So you spoke with about regarding the France and the Hip-Hop and with Switzerland and Finland and spoke about those countries being liberalized, and there's no Hip-Hop ban in the US because who's wearing the Hip-Hop, right?
I mean, that's like one reason. I don't know. It's not a priority, I said once, but yeah, it's not a.
Well, I was going to ask and build on that. I was going to say the soft power within the US is failing, and we see more hip-hop being on the streets. That there could be a hip-hop ban here as well.
I don't know. I mean, so like the brother's asking if soft power fails, like do people like revert to legislation? Well, we're seeing that. We're seeing that right now with LGBT. Right? The soft power of that has been pushed now for 25 years, at least. There's very few things that have been promoted and imposed on society more aggressively than that ideological program. And it has been pushed on movies, TV shows, in schools, it has been pushed by celebrities. You can't go anywhere without it. You really can't. I mean, I still tell people, I remember in 2015 when Obergefell, that like Supreme Court decision happened. I had a flight, and this was out of Dulles Airport. And I just wanted to see whether it was on time. And the entire airport website was rainbow colored. And I just thought, like, when did I care the airport's opinion on anything? Like, this is the airport, man. Why do I care what the airport thinks about this? Like, who goes to the airport and thinks, like, they agree with my politics, my view. This is like Dulles Airport, right? They have to signal their support for this stuff. And so this is ubiquitous now, right? We saw pictures of London. One of the brothers was saying, Ellicott City looks the same way. Like a flag every single block, every single block in Old Town, right? And so that's as aggressive as soft power can get. And now what you have are Muslim parents and Muslim families that are like saying, no, these are still our beliefs. Because what they're doing now is that they're passing laws and legislation in ways where it's becoming more hard power. They have to revert to them. So they're saying, we're going to start putting it in schools. We're going to put it in schools so that you can't even opt out. You can't even opt out of these teachings of these classes. And it's not going to be one day, it's going to be weeks. Some of the schools, there was one like elementary school in Howard County that said for the whole month of June until school ended. It's like every single day they were going to do a class reading, like an LGBT book, every single day. I told one of the brothers, I said, I feel like I am more eager for school to end for those kids than the kids themselves. Like, I just want the school year to be over with. Well, I just want them to get out of that. Is this what they're doing? Like, they have to force it. They have to force it. They're asking themselves, how much should we tolerate people who disagree with us? What should we, like, how much of their beliefs should we tolerate? And so you're definitely having that in the school level right now. And it's getting very, very aggressive. In addition to that, you're having a number of laws that are being proposed at the policy level to enforce LGBT and to really call into question how much society can tolerate it. What religious exemptions can you have? Really? What can I be exempt from? There's both the exemptions in the explicitly religious context where, okay, if like some two guys come to Inc. and say they want to get married, we have to recognize that or conduct the wedding, right? There's that, like we don't today, right? But there's that question, right? There's that question. And this is a point of political debate, right? And then the other question is, okay, well, forget if you're Inc. Let's say you open up a restaurant. Halal food, mashallah, this and that, you're a Muslim owner. And someone says, I want to reserve the restaurant for my gay wedding. So that's going to take place in the restaurant. Are you allowed to say no to them? Right? Like at what point, like they're pushing in the walls for people's ability to say, look, I don't agree with this. And I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to be a part of it. And they're targeting children really aggressively right now. And so like, a lot of Muslims, it's weird, they'll look at France and say France is like this crazy country, they've done all this stuff. And I'm like, okay, but take a step back and look at what's happening right now and what's happened in the US over the past 2 to 3 years. Do you know that like 8 or 9 states in this country have bills on the books that have institutionalized LGBT teachings throughout the entire state's public school systems. The entire state, Illinois, New York, New Jersey, California, Washington, tons of Muslims live in these places. The entire state public school, starting at the pre-K level, so 3 years old. That's what's happening. That's already done. That's not like khalas, like they're talking about it. And that happened like 3 years ago. And it's there, right? Like now, in public school, you have to have your kid in school. How many Muslims can homeschool? How many can send them to Islamic school? Probably a small subset. Everyone else is getting taught that, top down, that this is right and this is wrong on this issue. And they're getting taught that from the age of 3. How many Muslim kids are being exposed to that? 4 states, right? And so like now you're talking to someone and say, okay, like the sort of the freedom arrangement and settlement in America is really being challenged when Muslims and more Muslims kind of stand up. Like even on this issue, like no one's protesting it outside of Muslims. Very few people are protesting, right? Like it's just kind of us out there. And I look at that and I say, alhamdulillah, like this should be a point of pride for them. This should be a point of pride for us, that Muslims are actually standing up and saying, like, who cares if no one else joins us? I don't care if one other non-Muslim comes with us, right? What's important for us is that we're standing up because at the end of the day, this matters. This matters for us. And so when you talk about like, oh, like the sort of differences here and will that ever happen? It can happen. It can definitely happen. And that's a scary thing. And that's why, like as Muslims, I would say, like this is need to be engaged in certain spaces that they may not normally be engaged, simply because that settlement, like this is not guaranteed. And at some point, Allah knows, like when your ability to practice your deen gets strict and strict and strict and strict, the only choice is hit it at that point anyway, right? And so Allah protect us. Allah protect us, our families, and our society. Allah knows best.
What is followers like saying like because like the correct generals were saying men should act like this, women should act like this. And I remember my sister responded on the internet. She was like, "Oh, the reason women are acting like this is because men are not taking care. They're not acting like men. So we have to like change ourselves." I guess the different generals. So the question is like, how do you respond to this? Do you say like, "Oh, you're right. We have to like."
So the brother's asking more like gender questions. So I guess some sisters say men aren't acting like men, so women have to act like men. Okay, well, a man, I guess would that be if women aren't acting like women, men should act like women or something? I mean, that's like, I mean, what type of logic is that? No, right? Like I wouldn't say that, oh, like women aren't doing their jobs, so suddenly we're all just gonna start acting like women. No, it's ridiculous, right? Like we don't just like, we just have to fill some random void that's there. No. You know, what we would say is that Allah has given certain duties and obligations to men, and He's given some to women. That men are falling short, they need to be reminded. But Allah gave us qawwam. He said that men are qawwamun ala nisa. They have a sense of authority and responsibility and duties, and they have that over women. And so men are not sort of dispensing with their authority reasonably or appropriately or in a way that corresponds to what their requirements are, then that's a fault of things, right? Like they should be reminded. They should be reminded. Likewise the women, right? That this religion is a giving of plantains, and it's also a warning for us. And so we need to be bound every once in a while, especially when we're falling, we're straying. And that's as true for men as it is for women. And so I'd say that like if men aren't sort of fulfilling their duties and obligations in Islam, that's a problem, and we need to remind men to do so. If women aren't doing so, then we need to remind them. And like one group not doing it doesn't become an excuse just to like, I don't know, just stop living as a Muslim, right? Or completely abandoning what your obligations are. So Allah knows best. Head inshallah. Stop here. Barakallah fiik. Huh?
Kid who asked a question left, so I think that's
Okay.
Other than getting lessons, so inshallah, we can probably all the benches, inshallah. And before we have the adhan, we'll still continue with our Sahih Majlis. today, inshallah, 10-15 minutes. And then for that will be around 2:15 to 20. Salah will be 2:30, and lunch will be served after that, inshallah. Please remain for the majlis, for dhikr, for the salah, for lunch as well, inshallah. And some very important announcements after the salah, inshallah.
Shall I close this up? End the meeting?